Young Bobby Engels has a problem. He needs to earn the respect of his peers. So he gets the special Sega Genesis fighting system. It comes with Streets of Rage 2. He saves $40. He gets more moves. He gets more control. Now things are pretty much okay.
I said chocolate chip. Say it. Say it.
Sega! Hello everyone! Before we dive in, this video assumes a working knowledge of Sega's actual history. If you're unfamiliar with their journey through the hardware wars of the 80s and 90s, I recommend starting there. I'll add a couple links in the description to videos that cover that exact topic if you're curious. This won't be a rehash of what actually happened, it will be an all-new timeline. One where a few smarter moves early on meant that Sega never had to pull out of the console market. I'd love to hear what ideas and changes you'd include in your own Sega timeline. Leave those in the comments. But without further ado, here is what would happen if Sega never stopped making consoles. If Sega hadn't dropped the ball with the Saturn, we would have seen way more back and forth between them, Sony, Nintendo, and later, Microsoft.
Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh? Wow, Sonic's fast, too. No, over here. I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less. Sweet kid, that game I'll take Sonic and Genesis. I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
This more competitive market would further push the industry forward. So, in 1993, Sega did the unthinkable. They took a breath. Rather than blindside retailers with a half-baked console and a prayer, Sega delayed the Saturn by nearly a year. Internal war rooms in both Japan and America finally reached a consensus. If they were going to survive Sony's incoming wave and Nintendo's market stranglehold, they needed to make the Saturn into something more than just another machine. They had to make it something that stood out and offered something to be desired. So they gutted the whole mess. Out went the infamously over-engineered dual CPU layout that scared off developers faster than asking them to port their games to mobile. In came a cleaner, more approachable architecture co-designed with Hitachi. But the real weapon was in the software. Enter Sage, the Sega Advanced Game Engine. Inside of Sage were multiple modular development toolkits that were tailored to developing specific game genres. Sega Atlas gave RPG developers a toolkit with plug-and-play turn-based combat and scene scripting. Blast Corps handed shoot-'em-up and beat-'em-up devs a service so efficient you could practically build Gunstar heroes during your lunch break. Yes, these were modular dev kits, akin to something like RPG Maker, but decades earlier. By November 1995, the Saturn launched in Japan, and for once, Sega was fully prepared. Virtua Fighter ran at a buttery smooth 60 FPS and proved the Saturn could handle 3D after all. Phantasy Star V, built entirely in Atlas, had full voice acting, branching dialogue, and a story that was on par with the fourth game. They had fully learned their lesson from Phantasy Star 3. As it turns out, it's not a good idea to fire your music team or replace your scriptwriters with a drunk Star Wars fan you found on the street.
Say the alphabet backwards from Z to A.
I wouldn't even be able to do that if I was sober.
Okay. Yeah. Can you just put the lightsaber away for us first?
And Blast Radius X, originally just a tech demo, became a surprise pack-in hit, showcasing sprite scaling, pseudo 3D bosses, and the fact that Sega can create an amazing spectacle without sacrificing gameplay. Oh, and the console came with a pack-in modem. SegaNet didn't flop here, it was live on day one. The US launch in early 1996 was, dare I say, competent. Unlike our timeline, it wasn't surprise dumped on retailers 4 months early. Because of this, retailers and Sega were able to fully promote and stock the console at retailers nationwide.
Now you may return to the world as you know it. And remember, look for Sega Saturn. It's out there.
Sega packed in 2 full games, dropped a demo disc, and rolled out flashy promotional kiosks. Meanwhile, Sony showed up with cinematic FMVs and an overworked PR team trying to convince everyone that those counted as gameplay. Sega showed up with games, lots of them, and for once the third parties were on Team Sega. Falcom embraced Sage's Atlas, dropping Ys 5 Eternal Journey with rapid-fire development cycles. Konami used Blast Corps to release Castlevania Symphony of the Night as a Saturn exclusive. To this day, it is considered to be the best Castlevania game. Capcom dropped arcade-perfect ports of Street Fighter Alpha and Darkstalkers, and Sega's own back catalog got a second wind. Nights into Dreams launched later and with better utilization of the Saturn's hardware. There was less pop-in and cleaner models. It also featured a more fleshed out story that expanded on its weird, dreamy atmosphere. And it had more gameplay variety. There were overall more types of puzzles and other things to spice up the gameplay. Panzer Dragoon Saga also got the treatment it deserved. A polished UI, clearer textures, a real full orchestra for the soundtrack, a stronger second half, and more side content. Panzer Dragoon was their 3D tech demo on launch. Panzer Dragoon Zwei was a bigger and more in-depth version of the first game, and Panzer Dragoon Saga quickly became the Saturn RPG, and arguably the best RPG of this console generation. Dragon Force was labeled too niche by executives whose creative lens can only see as far as the next quarterly earnings report, but it turned into a cult phenomenon thanks to Atlus's tactical extensions and a simplified UI. And then came in Sonic Extreme. It was built in Blast Corps with fully 3D gameplay, there was no camera-induced nausea, and they made bosses that went full Sega, meaning that they looked like abstract art drawn by someone in the middle of a stroke. Surely a good thing. It launched holiday 1996 to record sales, making Sonic in 3D relevant again. Arcade ports like Radiant Silvergun, Daytona USA, and Virtual On hit the mark with shocking accuracy. Thanks to Sega's new ingenious decision to let their arcade teams actually speak to the console devs, the Saturn had its new, massive home console games, and at the same time, it was able to bring the arcade home in a way that didn't feel like a downgrade. Unlike its competitors, the N64 used cartridges instead of discs. Cartridges are incredibly tight for storage, which meant that massive RPGs, especially in the 3D era, were not able to fit onto those cartridges. This is why the only real RPGs on the N64 are Paper Mario and Quest 64. To put it lightly, these games are limited in scope compared to other RPGs of the time. In our timeline, with the Saturn performing poorly, and the N64 using those damn cartridges, the original PlayStation was the go-to for RPGs on console at a time when RPGs were very popular. In this timeline, the PlayStation would lose this niche entirely. So by 1997, the Saturn had outsold the PlayStation in Japan and was rapidly gaining ground globally. It was no longer the weird cousin of the console family. In 1999, in comes the Dreamcast with full backward compatibility for Saturn games. Sega also revamped their Sage suite and continued to update and support SegaNet. They had seemingly learned from previous missteps and kept up their momentum. The Dreamcast was everything the Saturn was building toward. A sleek machine with architecture that was simple to develop for because of its evolved Sage suite. It allowed indie studios to make games that seemed AAA. Sega had fans and developers practically frothing at the mouth. Super Monkey Ball became Sega's surprise casual Dreamcast launch title. It was a unique platformer in that you controlled the entire stage instead of the actual Monkey Ball. With SegaNet being bigger than in our timeline, you could do online matchmaking for Monkey Target, Monkey Bowling, and Monkey Fight. The couch co-op was still arguably even more fun. Online leaderboards for the single-player levels made for a massive competitive speedrunning scene. Crazy Taxi became a global addiction, It had online leaderboards and downloadable user-generated custom routes. Listening to The Offspring while causing pure chaos will never not be fun. Jet Set Radio hit harder than ever with its online multiplayer modes. You could compete with friends to see who could tag the most stuff in 5 minutes, or there was a Cops and Robbers mode too. Defender of the Future, released as the next sequel in the Echo the Dolphin series, it was known for being the best looking game out at the time. Like in our timeline, the game felt like a nature documentary at first, and then slowly morphed into something you might read from H.P. Lovecraft. It was a visual and thematic spectacle. Shenmue got the redemption arc it deserved. Instead of dragging a dying console behind it like a ball and chain, it ran free. It had faster pacing and online minigame leaderboards. It spawned sequels and a full movie. Shenmue 3 arrived in 2004, but not as a Hail Mary. It was a polished continuation that finally made good on its original promise, no crowdfunding required. And Panzer Dragoon soared, with Panzer Dragoon Saga establishing it as a proper RPG franchise last generation. Panzer Dragoon Orta dropped early in the Dreamcast lifecycle with cinematic flair. It cemented its place as a Sega tentpole. It was a rail shooter meets deep mythology with a fan base that treated it like gospel. Phantasy Star Online launched in 2000 and surpassed Sega's expectations by an entire level of magnitude. They expected around 500,000 sales, give or take, but they actually sold 6 million copies worldwide by 2004. With years of SegaNet stability behind it, Phantasy Star Online became the first console MMORPG that actually worked. Cross-region servers, cloud saves, co-op raids, and no subscription fees. It had an active player count of 4 million. In this timeline, it was the biggest MMORPG in the world until 2004, when Blizzard entered the chat. That same year, Legacy of Arcadia struck like a thunderbolt. Developed by Overworks with help from the Skies of Arcadia crew, Legacy of Arcadia was an action RPG set in the skies. It was part Devil May Cry and part airship pirate opera. You would pilot a customizable Skyblade and make your way through floating ruins and spectacular aerial boss fights. It sold about as well as any spin-off could. Speaking of which, Skies of Arcadia was the Dreamcast RPG. It ran smoother, had amazing graphics, and it was fully voice acted. The combat set a new standard for TRPGs by removing the grid system and making everything more fluid. It outsold Final Fantasy IX globally and probably made a Square executive cry in a conference room. But the most unexpected breakout was Pen Pen Triicelon. This triathlon on ice became Sega's unhinged answer to Mario Kart, if Mario Kart did DMT. Of course, it wasn't nearly as popular as Mario Kart 64 or Double Dash, but it was a good start. It had a cult following and more visibility just by virtue of the Dreamcast selling better. By the end of the Dreamcast era, Sega was on top of the world. Both the Saturn and Dreamcast had sold better and had a more active player base than the N64, GameCube, and Xbox respectively. They were neck and neck with Sony, and actually overall ahead of Nintendo and Microsoft, who had lost a lot of heavy-hitting games to Sega in this time. You can see on screen now just how many games that were released for the Xbox, GameCube, and PlayStation 2 in our timeline that would have been Sega exclusives in this timeline. But this was just the beginning. By 2003, Sega were more than just surviving, they were thriving. Which means still weird, but now making boatloads of money too. With the launch of the Sega Aurora, they stepped into the HD era not with fanfare, but with the confidence and kind of smugness only earned by being competent. While Sony was busy designing the PlayStation 3 to resemble a small appliance, and Microsoft still thought that online avatars were the future of social interaction, Sega dropped the Aurora, and marketed it like a fever dream someone had on an airplane. The Aurora's specs were forward-thinking. It had a controller with a built-in touchpad and keyboard, a pack-in full-sized keyboard and mouse, 720p output, Dreamcast backwards compatibility, solid-state memory that loaded games faster than a coked-up Sonic the Hedgehog, and Sega Net 2.0, their online backbone. But it wasn't only the specs that mattered, it was the games. There's this little-known strategy series, you may not have heard of it, called Total War. Originally PC only, Sega brought the franchise to consoles with native keyboard and mouse support on the Aurora. The UI was redesigned to fit in a living room setup without losing depth. In this timeline, it became the go-to strategy title for players who wanted a Civilization-style game on console. Early in the Aurora's life cycle, Sega would try another competitor to Mario Kart called Sega and All-Stars Racing Transformed. It was just a copycat of Mario Kart with playable famous Sega characters, and it was a commercial failure. People just didn't see the game as interesting enough to warrant a purchase, and frankly, Sega didn't put enough time or effort into it. It was half-baked. Even in our timeline, Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed was more popular due to Sonic's place as the Sega character. In this timeline, he is only one of many Sega franchises that are popular, so there was no reason to name the game after him, and it fell flat. However, Sega wasn't finished trying to create their Mario Kart competitor just yet. They just wanted to finish some other projects first. With Atlas firmly in Sega's corner, Persona 3, and later Persona 4, became flagship RPGs for the Aurora era. Owners of the console were able to spend hundreds or thousands of hours fighting monsters in an alternate world before trying to make it back in time to high school chemistry class. The real battle in Persona games is trying to make progress in the game while keeping a job in real life. Or for people that wanted more tactics in their RPG, Valkyria Chronicles was also an Aurora exclusive. Shinobi Zero was a revelation. Sega's competitor to Assassin's Creed, it was set in a cyber-feudal Tokyo, where you could climb onto any rooftop to stalk enemies throughout a neon-lit city. The game let you define your own shinobi code. You could be a sneaky assassin, or an honorable duelist, or just a guy who throws smoke bombs and runs away. It was cool, stylish, and the first time a ninja game made you feel like you were actually doing ninja stuff, and not just cosplaying one. Then there was Skies of Arcadia Stranded. Skies of Arcadia Stranded was a multiplayer survival RPG set in the same universe as Skies of Arcadia. But this time you weren't a sky pirate, you were just trying to not get eaten by whatever the hell lives under the floating rocks. You and your friends could create towns, fly around in airships or wingsuits, build artificial floating islands and bridges between them. This was the first major survival sandbox game, which in this timeline released years before Minecraft. Even better, Sega pulled off the crossover of the decade. The base you built in Skies of Arcadia Stranded, you know, that cozy sky village you and your buddies couldn't keep from burning down every day, could be exported directly into their new city builder game, Skies of Arcadia Tycoon. That's right, you could just barely survive hellish nights on a remote floating island, thousands of miles away from anything but the blue sky in all directions, and then turn around, import it into the other game, and zone it for residential use. Skies of Arcadia Tycoon introduced players to city planning in the sky. Phantasy Star Online 2 launched soon after, expanding the Phantasy Star Online formula into a seamless galaxy of exploration and party-based tactics. Instead of controlling a character, you controlled a small party with which you could fully customize. It was important to synergize the characters in your party, as well as making a party that could work well with your friends' parties. It was always a good time dragging your sleepy friends into late-night 3-hour-long raids. This game was beloved, but notably less popular than the first installment. Sonic 06 had a bigger budget in this timeline, but it still went down as one of the worst Sonic games. It still had some technical issues, level design issues, and a convoluted story, but the increased size of the budget and amount of developers means that it was a mediocre game instead of a terrible game. In 2007, facing new hardware from Microsoft and Sony, Sega launched the Aurora HX, a beefed-up, full HD capable monster that invented the concept of a mid-generation refresh before anyone else understood that consoles could age like milk. Games ran better, online got sharper, and Sega stayed ahead and competent. The HX launched with the game MechForge Arena, an online mech battler that let you build your own mech with as much customization as a game like Besieged or Kerbal Space Program. Arms, legs, boosters, everything was unlockable and customizable. Thousands of different parts could be unlocked as you level up. The only rule was if you made it, you had to live with it. Which meant, yes, some people built mechs that were just 5 sniper rifles duct taped to a shopping cart. And yes, those people probably won tournaments too. Alien Isolation released shortly after. It was a first-person survival horror game built around a single adaptive enemy. The alien used dynamic AI to hunt the player, reacting to sound, movement, and previous encounters to decide what to do to you. Stealth and resource management were key instead of combat. In this timeline, it was a standout Sega exclusive that proved they could handle slow, high-tension horror just as well as they handled arcade chaos. It was the rare game where firing your gun usually meant you just made your death a bit louder. Then comes Sonic Unleashed. Powered by the refined Sage 3D engine, Sonic Unleashed featured sprawling, fast-paced day stages that ran at 60 FPS. The Werehog transformation only happened in short bursts during boss fights or other combat-heavy parts, rather than padding the whole game with it. It had a combat system that was fine-tuned by the Shinobi Zero team to make those boss fights fun and challenging. The game also leaned hard into world building. There were explorable hub cities, side missions, and even a boss rush mode, so you could fight bosses as many times as you wanted as the Werehog. It was universally praised. Fans called it Sonic Adventure 3 in everything but name, and thanks to SegaNet integration, players could post time trial runs and custom challenge routes online, which turned Sonic Unleashed into a community favorite for years. Meanwhile, Panzer Dragoon was soaring higher than ever. Following the massive critical and commercial redemption of Panzer Dragoon Saga on Saturn, and its stunning successor for Dreamcast, Sega doubled down. Panzer Dragoon Scion launched early in the Aurora HX lifecycle, but with expanded RPG elements, branching missions, and a full orchestra. It redefined the rail shooter for HD. It was like Star Fox with deeper lore, the kind you read on a wiki at 3 AM while asking yourself what went wrong with your life. Echo Leviathan Depths brought our sweet Cetacean Prince back strong. It picked up where Defender of the Future left off, diving deeper into the ocean and into the psyche. It was part survival horror, part eco-philosophy sim, and part action puzzle hybrid. And finally, Sega solved its kart racing identity crisis by doing what they do best, saying screw it and doing something cooler. After the commercial failure of Sega All-Stars Racing, they merged it with Pen Pen Triathlon. They transformed it into one chaotic, long-running mega franchise, Sega Velocity. Sega Velocity was the fastest racing game we've ever seen. The only thing comparable is F-Zero. Each game featured weird-ass creatures, iconic Sega characters, and courses that transformed mid-race across land, sea, sky, and space. Sonic wasn't the mascot, he was just another character behind the wheel. The Pen Pens themselves became breakout stars. Tournaments were held worldwide. Sega Velocity was considered one of, if not the best, arcade racing game. By the end of the Aurora HX era, Sega was still on top. In school playgrounds around the world, kids were arguing about what the best console was. Was it the Wii, Xbox 360, PS3, or the Sega Aurora? In 2013, the gaming industry was spiraling into chaos. Microsoft had introduced the Xbox One with the bold promise of mandatory internet connection and disallowing used games.
Gone the other way if we didn't do it, and fortunately we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360. That's your message if you don't, like it?
If you have zero access to the internet, that is an offline device. I mean, seriously.
Basically the console equivalent of asking customers to smile while being mugged. Sony pivoted swiftly, capitalizing on Microsoft's missteps with tactical precision.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
But Sega didn't need to respond with press conferences or cheap shots. They just dropped the Sega Horizon like a mic. No gimmicks, no Orwellian DRM, no creepy, always listening cameras, just a sleek black box loaded with simplicity and power. The Sega Horizon was a developer's dream. It was easy to work with and backwards compatible all the way to the Saturn. SegaNet 3.0 offered seamless matchmaking and online services that worked without needing a 3-day firmware update. The one thing they shot for was a strong launch lineup. Sonic Lost World took a more experimental approach, ditching the usual boost formula for parkour mechanics and gravity-defying level design. In this timeline, that gamble paid off. The controls were tightened, and the level variety hit a good rhythm. It still looked like a Dr. Seuss book, but now it played like a proper evolution of Sonic's platforming roots. Total War Warhammer was one of the standouts. It took the entire series fully into fantasy, with wildly asymmetric factions that felt like you were playing a different game entirely. On the Horizon, it launched as a full trilogy collection, with full modding support. The Warhammer trilogy brought in the players more interested in the lore of fictional universes than actual history. Meanwhile, Power Slave Ascension came back swinging. The gameplay was fast and brutal, but it still kept that methodical, Metroidvania-style puzzle solving. Some of the sections could be traversed on customizable vehicles like motorcycles, dune buggies, and giant scarabs. There were now stealth options and massive new boss fights with a great storyline to boot. You dual-wielded rocket launchers while lava surfing and punching mummies in the face. It was everything your 13-year-old self ever dreamed of. Panzer Dragoon Revenant Skies was a fusion of Orta's high-speed rail shooter combat and Saga's RPG depth, all wrapped in a Renaissance-era painting aesthetic. You rode on dragons that evolved based on moral choices and explored oil-painted open areas between battles. The world felt like if Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel painting met Dark Souls. The enemies looked like they crawled out of a medieval tapestry, the battles played out under skies that looked painted in golden ash with a tone that leaned heavily into Divine Comedy territory. You'd pick your path through branching missions, and your dragon's appearance and abilities would change based on your moral choices. Revenant Skies didn't hit the mainstream, but the people who played it never shut up about it. For good reason. It was weird, gorgeous, and it didn't care if it lost you. Then there was Sega Velocity X, the newest entry into the fast-paced Sega Racer franchise. Courses didn't just change mid-race, they collapsed, exploded, flooded, inverted gravity, and sometimes just plain vanished. You raced on wheels, in water, in the sky, and through interdimensional warp tubes, with a character roster so gigantic that it had a Sega executive as a playable driver. Sonic was there, sure, but so were the Pen-Pens, flipping off people with their flippers. It was glorious. Echo Tides of Requiem took a more existential route. This was a deep-sea odyssey of isolation, subtle horror, and some of the best underwater exploration. You were a telepathic savior of the universe, unraveling the secrets of an ancient alien ocean. The game had no HUD, no markers, and was very difficult. Unfortunately, this game was the first Echo the Dolphin game to receive less than an 80% review score. People didn't like the shift away from the older, faster-paced gameplay, and there were lots of reviewers talking about Sega getting more pretentious and being out of ideas. Phantasy Star Online 4 took the MMO formula to the next level by embracing Sega's greatest asset, complete creative chaos. The game ditched traditional classes for multipath character builds, and gave players the ability to host their own servers with their own user-generated galaxies. Entire wars were fought over resource planets, factions rose and fell, one player became a quadrillionaire warlord because he cornered the market on synthetic carrots. Sega didn't stop him, they put his face on billboards around the world. Skies of Arcadia Tempest Realms made its triumphant return with a fully explorable open sky world. You could just be a pirate or a king running a city-state. It was kind of like Sky Island Mountain Blade. You could negotiate trade, wage war, fall in love, and uncover the buried gods of the world. Vice returned as an aging legend, Ica ran a pirate council, and the soundtrack was universally praised. The Horizon sold very well, outselling the Wii U and Xbox One, By 2016, it had become the go-to platform for creative experimentation. They were considered to have the most interesting games. Sony and Xbox fans would maybe have said weird instead of interesting, but they were unique nonetheless. Sega was keeping up its momentum by continuing to do what it did best, making not only unique, but also good games. By 2019, the industry had settled into a steady rhythm. Sony was continuing its run of polished cinematic titles. Microsoft was exploring cloud gaming with ambitious but early efforts. And Nintendo was still finding ways to keep its biggest hits alive across generations. Meanwhile, Sega had been flying under the radar, refining its strengths and getting ready to make a confident forward. Sega decided it was time to drop the Sega Omega. It was built on chiplet-based architecture and had AI-assisted rendering. The Omega was a beast in a sleek frame. It ran everything from Master System classics to massive next-gen games flawlessly. The performance made you finally understand what they meant by blast processing all those years ago, and the branding was unapologetically Sega. But the Omega wasn't all about flaunting Sega's past. It was going to be a leader in the next-gen console space. First in line, of course, was Sonic Frontiers, a complete reinvention of the franchise. This Sonic operated in a physics-driven open zones world with AI rival races. Every character had their own movement system. The story, of course, leaned into sci-fi weirdness and chaos theory. This game was controversial. Some loved it for its reinvented gameplay loop, its new physics engine, and its speed. Others didn't like it because of a few reasons. One was because of the sci-fi weirdness that Sega had been doing for too many Sonic games in a row. The other was that they redid a lot of music from the older games, and fans were not pleased with how these remakes sounded. Of course, there were some less than rational issues some people took with the game as well. Total War 3 Kingdoms was the Omega's fix for strategy fans. Set in ancient China, it had improved diplomacy and a massive campaign map packed with political scheming and large-scale battles. It was the first in the series to nail full console support without dumbing anything down. In this timeline, it became Sega's answer to Civilization, except instead of building wonders, you were mostly setting fire to rice fields. In Europe, Football Manager was a hit. On Sega consoles, it became one of their most played franchises in the EU thanks to tight SegaNet and integration and live league updates. Phantasy Star Nexus was an MMO and a campaign-driven space opera. Sega assigned a team to man a full-time game master role, which was aided by AI. In the game, events were shaped by collective decision-making and player-led alliances. There was the basic RPG stuff like grinding for gear and fighting in raids, but there were also full-on faction wars, economy simulation, and city planning. One GM decision accidentally turned a quarter of the galaxy into a black hole. Players voted to keep it. Sega, as always, obliged. MechForge Solaris War expanded the franchise into interstellar warfare. Instead of one mech, you now ran entire squads, custom AIs, paint jobs, and pilot personalities included. Players crafted blueprints, traded on black markets, and formed armies made up of squads of mechs to fight other armies off their territory. There was an in-game economy on each of the 50 game servers that were live at a time. Each server had its own massively procedurally generated universe that players exploited and fought for control over. Several other familiar franchises also made their return this generation, each pushing their formula further. Sega Velocity Omega cranked the speed up even higher. Power Slave Eclipse Protocol became Sega's answer to Doom Eternal with more Metroidvania elements, and Panzer Dragoon Omega Flame evolved the series into a full-blown action RPG shooter. 2 years later, the universe expanded again with Panzer Dragoon Valkyrie Spire, a tactical turn-based spin-off that brought a new strategic layer to the series. Other forgotten Sega IPs made their Omega returns too. Rystar Cosmic Bloom brought back the titular Rystar in a kaleidoscopic platformer that made Ori and the Blind Forest look almost grayscale by comparison. Comic Zone Reloaded brought back the Comic Zone to the modern day, and Shining Force Parallax Crusade offered a mechanically heavy alternative to Fire Emblem, with deeper customization and a tone that leaned more epic than personal. By 2025, Sega was in a position no one would have predicted 2 decades earlier. The Omega had cemented their place in the modern console landscape. Their hardware was solid, and their first-party output was as creative and weird as it had ever been. Games like Bayonetta, Yakuza, and Alien Isolation are all Sega IPs, or heavily associated with Sega. In this timeline, they, along with many other franchises, never land on the other consoles. This would have altered the landscape completely. The other companies would have most likely created equivalent franchises in order to compete with the now exclusive Sega games. The picture is clear. This extra competition would have led to major innovations across the board. But with that success comes new pressure. Expectations are higher, the novelty of a Sega comeback is worn off, and now the question is simple. What's next? Can they keep surprising people without slipping into self-parody? Can they scale without losing the experimental energy that got them there? Sega must fight in order to continue to stay relevant long term. Yes, this scenario grew stranger as it went, but so did Sega in the best of timelines. Of course, we'll never truly know what would have happened if Sega stayed in the console race, but this was just one version of that possibility. Let me know your version in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.